He rode for 20 years running from his past, until he found her bleeding in the sand, clutching a secret that would either save them both or destroy everything he'd built in the wilderness. Don't forget to hit that subscribe button and ring the bell, because stories like this one remind us why the Old West never truly died. The lonely cowboy found a wounded woman in the desert. She changed his life forever. Hook, 0 to 60 seconds. He rode for 20 years running from his past, until he found her bleeding in the sand, clutching a secret that would either save them both or destroy everything he'd built in the wilderness. Don't forget to hit that subscribe button and ring the bell, because stories like this one remind us why the Old West never truly died. Quick context. The year was 1887, deep in the unforgiving Badlands of Arizona Territory, where the sun carved shadows into red stone cliffs and mercy was rarer than water. This wasn't cowboy country anymore. This was the land of the forgotten, where men came to disappear and ghosts walked among the living. Here, in a canyon so remote that even the Apache avoided it, lived Thomas, Silent Tom, Harrow, a man whose reputation once echoed from Tombstone to Dodge City. But that was before the incident in Silver Creek, before the children, before he hung up his guns and rode into exile. Silent Tom had built his sanctuary in the bones of an old mining camp, surrounded by nothing but wind-carved stone and the whispers of his own regrets. His weathered hands, once steady enough to split a playing card at 50 paces, now tended a small garden and mended fences that kept nothing in and nothing out. The locals in the nearest town, 3 days' hard ride east, spoke of him in hushed tones, the gunslinger who'd lost his voice along with his soul. They said he'd taken a vow of silence after what happened, that he'd never speak again until he found redemption. For 2 decades, Tom had kept that promise, communicating only through gestures and the occasional scrawled note. His blue eyes, once sharp as winter steel, had grown soft with solitude and sorrow. Every sunrise brought the same routine: tend the horses, check the water, scan the horizon for trouble that never came. Until the morning when the desert wind carried something different, the sound of a woman crying, broken and desperate, echoing off the canyon walls like a prayer nobody wanted to hear. The sun was barely painting the eastern peaks when Tom heard it, a sound that didn't belong in his world of silence and stone. Following the cry through a maze of red rock formations, his weathered boots crunched on sand that told stories in footprints and bloodstains. What he found would crack open 20 years of carefully built walls around his heart. There, collapsed beside a dried creek bed, lay a young Mexican woman, her dark hair matted with dust and blood, her torn dress revealing wounds that spoke of violence and desperate flight. Maria Esperanza Delgado was barely conscious, her olive skin pale with blood loss, clutching a leather satchel to her chest like it contained her very soul. The way she'd fallen, the scattered supplies, the horse tracks leading back toward the border, it all painted a picture Tom had seen too many times before. She was running from something or someone, and whatever it was had been willing to shoot a woman in the back to stop her. As Tom knelt beside her still form, Maria's eyes fluttered open, dark as midnight, filled with pain but blazing with a fierce determination that reminded him of someone he'd tried for 20 years to forget. She whispered something in Spanish, words that sounded like a prayer or maybe a curse, and pressed that leather satchel deeper into her chest. Blood seeped through her fingers, painting the sand beneath them the color of old sins. Tom's hands moved without thought, checking her pulse, assessing her wounds with the practiced efficiency of a man who'd seen too much violence. But as he prepared to lift her, Maria grabbed his wrist with surprising strength and spoke the first English words he'd heard in his canyon for years. "Don't let them find what I carry. Promise me." The desperation in her voice shattered something inside him, and for the first time in 2 decades, Silent Tom Harrow wanted to speak. But what happened next would change everything. Tom's old mining shack had never hosted anyone but ghosts and regrets, but as he laid Maria on his rough-hewn bed, the space seemed to come alive with purpose. Her fever broke on the 3rd day, and with it came fragments of her story, told in a mixture of Spanish and heavily accented English that painted pictures of wealth, betrayal, and blood money. She was the daughter of Don Carlos Delgado, one of the richest landowners south of the Rio Grande, but that heritage had become a curse rather than a blessing. The leather satchel she guarded so fiercely contained documents that could topple empires, land grants, mining rights, and correspondence that proved her father had been selling weapons to both sides of every border conflict for the past decade. Maria had discovered his treachery by accident, copying what she thought were business ledgers, only to uncover evidence of murder, bribery, and deals with men who wore badges by day and burned villages by night. When she'd confronted him, demanding he stop the bloodshed, Don Carlos had made his choice clear: marry the son of his business partner, a brutal man named Vicente Morales, or die with her dangerous knowledge. Tom watched her tell this story in halting English, her hands trembling not from weakness but from the weight of carrying such terrible truth. The Old West was built on secrets buried in unmarked graves, but this young woman held papers that could expose a network of corruption stretching from Mexico City to Washington. As she spoke, Tom found himself nodding, understanding flooding through him like cool water in a drought. Here was someone else carrying the weight of knowledge that could destroy lives, someone else running from choices that had seemed impossible. But as Maria grew stronger, so did the signs that her pursuers were closing in. Strange riders appeared on the distant ridges, circling like vultures but never approaching. Tom's horses grew skittish, and the desert silence carried sounds that didn't belong: the distant ring of iron on stone, voices carried on the wind, the feeling of being watched by eyes that meant harm. The sanctuary Tom had built was about to become a trap, and what happened next would change everything. They came at dawn like shadows with teeth, 5 men on lathered horses led by a figure Tom recognized from wanted posters yellowed with age. Joaquin El Cazador Vargas, the hunter, whose reputation for tracking down runaway women was matched only by his cruelty toward those he caught. Behind him rode Vicente Morales himself, the man Maria was supposed to marry, his cold eyes scanning Tom's property like he was already deciding what to burn first. From his cabin window, Tom watched the riders spread out in a practiced formation, cutting off every escape route from the canyon. These weren't common bandits. They moved with military precision, each man covering the others as they dismounted and checked their weapons. Vicente wore a spotless white suit despite days in the desert, his silver-trimmed hat marking him as a man who'd never known hunger or honest work. But it was El Cazador who made Tom's blood run cold, tall and thin as a blade, with scars that mapped a lifetime of violence across his weathered face. "Thomas Harrow," El Cazador called out, his voice carrying easily across the morning air. "We know you're in there, and we know you have something that belongs to us. Send out the girl, and we'll pretend we never saw the famous silent Tom living like a hermit in the rocks." The casual way he spoke Tom's real name sent ice through the former gunslinger's veins. These men had done their homework, which meant they knew exactly who they were dealing with, and they'd come prepared for war. Maria appeared at Tom's elbow, her face pale but determined, still clutching that leather satchel. "I won't go back," she whispered. "I'd rather die here than live as that monster's wife." Tom looked into her eyes and saw the same desperate courage that had once driven him to stand up to impossible odds, before everything went wrong in Silver Creek. The choice before him was simple and terrible: break his 20-year vow of silence and violence, or watch an innocent woman be dragged away to a fate worse than death. But what happened next would change everything. As the hunters settled in to wait outside his canyon, Tom found himself face to face with memories he'd spent 2 decades trying to bury. Maria deserved to know who she was trusting with her life, so he sat her down and, for the first time in 20 years, began to speak. His voice came out rusty and broken, like a gate that hadn't been opened since winter, but the words flowed like water through a broken dam. He told her about Silver Creek, about the day he'd tried to be a hero and ended up destroying everything he'd sworn to protect. It had been 1867, and Tom was sheriff of a thriving mining town when word came that a gang of raiders was heading their way. The townspeople begged him to evacuate the school, to get the children to safety before the killers arrived. But Tom was proud, convinced his reputation alone would be enough to scare off any threat. He'd positioned himself in the main street, facing down 12 armed men with nothing but his twin Colts and his legendary name. The gunfight lasted less than a minute. Tom dropped 9 of them where they stood, but the remaining 3 had circled around behind him. They'd reached the schoolhouse before he could stop them, and what happened next still woke Tom up screaming on cold desert nights. 15 children ages 6 to 14, caught in crossfire that should never have reached them. When the smoke cleared and the bodies were counted, Tom Harrow's victory felt like the greatest defeat in the history of the West. The town buried its dead and ran him out on a rail, and he'd never spoken another word until this moment, sitting across from Maria as she listened to his confession with tears streaming down her face. "Now you know," Tom whispered, his voice already fading back toward silence. "I'm not a hero, Maria. I'm just a broken-down gunslinger who failed when it mattered most." But Maria reached across the table and took his weathered hands in hers. "Those children died because evil men chose to hurt them, not because you tried to stop it," she said. "And maybe God brought us together so you could get a second chance to do what's right." Outside, El Cazador was growing impatient, and what happened next would change everything. El Cazador's patience finally snapped as the sun reached its cruel peak overhead. A rifle shot shattered the desert silence, followed by the hunter's voice echoing off the canyon walls. "That was your water barrel, Harrow. Next shot goes through your cabin wall. Send out the girl, or we start burning you out." Tom peered through a crack in his shutters to see smoke already rising from his small stable. They weren't bluffing about turning his sanctuary into ash and memories. Maria stood beside him, her jaw set with the kind of determination that reminded Tom of every brave soul he'd ever known who died too young. "I won't let them destroy your home because of me," she said, already moving toward the door. But Tom's hand shot out, catching her wrist with surprising gentleness. "And I won't let them take you back to a life of slavery just to save some old boards and rusty nails," he replied, his voice growing stronger with each word. The choice was impossible: fight 5 professional killers and likely die in a blaze of gunfire, or watch an innocent woman be dragged away to a fate she feared more than death. But as Tom weighed their options, Maria pulled out the leather satchel and spread its contents across his rough wooden table. Maps, letters, and documents covered in official seals painted a picture that made his blood boil. Don Carlos hadn't just been selling weapons, he'd been organizing massacres, targeting small villages and Indian settlements that sat on valuable mining claims. Innocent families wiped out so rich men could get richer, with Vicente Morales as his father-in-law's enforcer, leading raids disguised as Apache attacks. "This is why they want me back so badly," Maria explained, her voice shaking with rage rather than fear. "Not just to marry their monster, but to make sure this evidence dies with me. Every day I stay free is another day these papers could reach the territorial governor, or the federal marshals, or the newspapers back east." Tom looked at the documents, then at Maria's face, and something that had been dead inside him for 20 years began to stir. This wasn't just about saving one woman, it was about stopping a network of killers who'd been getting away with murder for decades. But what happened next would change everything. Tom opened an old wooden chest that hadn't seen daylight in 2 decades, his hands trembling as he lifted out the gun belt that had once made his name legend from Dodge City to El Paso. The twin Colt .45s felt heavier than he remembered, their weight carrying not just steel and lead but 20 years of regret and self-imposed exile. Maria watched in silence as he strapped on the leather, her eyes wide as she witnessed the transformation of a broken hermit into something altogether more dangerous. "I made a promise 20 years ago that I'd never draw these guns again," Tom said, his voice carrying the weight of graves and broken dreams. "But some promises are meant to be broken when innocent lives hang in the balance." He checked the cylinders with practiced efficiency, muscle memory taking over where conscious thought feared to tread. 6 shots in each gun, 12 chances to make the past right, or die trying. The mathematics of gunfighting hadn't changed, but the man behind the weapons had been forged in 20 years of regret into something harder and more focused than ever before. Maria stepped closer, her small hand touching his arm as he prepared to walk into what might be his final sunrise. "You don't have to do this for me," she whispered. "These men, they're killers, professionals. You've been out of the game for 20 years. But Tom looked into her eyes and saw something that made his decision crystalline clear. This wasn't about redemption anymore, or even about making up for Silver Creek. This was about looking evil in the face and refusing to step aside, regardless of the cost. "Maybe I can't save those children from Silver Creek," Tom said, his voice steady as granite now. "But I'll be damned if I let you end up another victim of men who think money and power give them the right to destroy innocent lives." He opened the cabin door, and the desert heat hit him like a physical blow. Outside, 5 killers waited in whatever shade they could find, confident that time was on their side. But what happened next would change everything. Tom stepped into the blazing afternoon sun with the slow, deliberate walk of a man who'd made peace with his mortality. The 5 hunters looked up from their positions around his canyon, surprise flickering across their faces as they recognized the legend stepping out of myth and into the harsh light of reality. El Cazador rose from his crouch behind a boulder, his scarred face splitting into a grin that held no warmth whatsoever. "Well, well," the hunter called out, his voice carrying across the desert like the rattle of bones in a grave. Silent Tom Harrow breaks his famous vow. "Tell me, old man, was it worth 20 years of hiding just to die for some Mexican whore?" The insult hit Tom like a physical blow, but he kept walking, each step measured and purposeful. Behind him, Maria appeared in the doorway, her presence giving him strength he'd forgotten he possessed. Vicente Morales dismounted from his horse, adjusting his pristine white suit with the casual arrogance of a man who'd never faced real consequence for his actions. "You're making this harder than it needs to be, Harrow," he said, his accent thick with old Mexico privilege. "All we want is what belongs to us. Give us the girl and those papers she stole, and you can go back to your pathetic hermit's life." The way he spoke about Maria, like she was property to be collected rather than a human being with her own will, made Tom's hands itch for his guns. But Tom didn't draw. Not yet. Instead, he stopped about 50 feet from the nearest gunman and spoke in a voice that carried 20 years of built-up thunder. "The girl stays. The papers stay. You boys have about 30 seconds to mount up and ride out of my canyon before I remind you all why they used to speak my name in whispers from here to the Rio Grande." The silence that followed was thick as blood, broken only by the desert wind and the distant cry of a hawk circling overhead. What happened next would change everything. El Cazador's laughter echoed off the canyon walls like the sound of breaking glass. "You think your reputation scares us, old man? That was 20 years ago. Look at you now, gray hair, soft hands, living like a hermit because you couldn't handle the heat when things got real." The hunter's hand drifted toward his gun, testing Tom's reflexes, probing for weakness. Behind him, the other 4 killers spread out in a practiced formation, each man covering a different angle of attack. But Tom had spent 20 years thinking about gunfights, analyzing every mistake he'd made in Silver Creek, every split second that had led to tragedy. His mind was clearer now than it had ever been, stripped of the arrogance and showboating that had once defined his reputation. "You're right about one thing, Kazar," Tom said, his voice steady as carved stone. "I'm not the same man I was 20 years ago. I'm better." The first shot came from Tom's left, one of Vicente's men trying to catch him off guard. But Tom had been tracking every heartbeat, every bead of sweat, every tell that experienced killers couldn't hide. His right-hand Colt cleared leather like lightning made solid, barking once. The gunman spun and dropped, his weapon unfired. The remaining 4 hesitated for just a moment, long enough for Tom to realize that his 20 years of exile had been preparation, not punishment. El Cazador's eyes widened as he recognized what he was facing. This wasn't the broken-down sheriff they'd expected to intimidate. This was something new and terrible, a man who'd learned to live with failure and emerged from it like steel from a forge. "Kill him," the hunter screamed, going for his own gun. But Tom was already moving, both Colts singing their deadly song, and what happened next would change everything. The gunfight that followed lasted less than 15 seconds but would be talked about in saloons and around campfires for the next 50 years. Tom moved through the canyon like a force of nature, his twin Colts roaring with the accumulated fury of 2 decades spent mourning children he couldn't save. El Cazador, for all his reputation, had grown careless hunting defenseless women and unarmed villagers. He died with surprise frozen on his scarred face, Tom's bullet taking him center mass before his own gun cleared leather. Vicente's remaining men scattered like leaves in a hurricane, taking cover behind rocks and trying to find angles that would let them bring Tom down with crossfire. But the canyon that had been Tom's prison for 20 years now became his advantage. He knew every shadow, every ricochet angle, every piece of cover worth having. When the smoke cleared and the echoes faded, for bodies lay cooling in the desert sand, and Vicente Morales stood alone, his pristine white suit stained with dust and his own sweat. "This isn't over, Harrow," Vicente screamed, his composure finally cracking as he realized his hired killers were dead and his prize was slipping away. "My father-in-law has armies. He'll send every gun south of the border to hunt you down. You can't protect her forever." But even as he raged, Vicente was backing toward his horse, his own cowardice finally showing through the civilized veneer. Tom walked toward him with smoking guns still in his hands, and Vicente saw something in the old gunfighter's eyes that made his blood turn to ice water. This wasn't the legendary silent Tom of 20 years ago, full of pride and swagger. This was something far more dangerous. A man who'd found something worth dying for, and had just remembered what it felt like to be alive. "Mount up and ride," Tom said quietly, "and tell Don Carlos that his days of buying murder with Spanish gold are over." What happened next would change everything. Vicente fled into the desert like a kicked dog, leaving behind 5 graves and the knowledge that his comfortable world of purchased violence had just been shattered by a man who was supposed to be broken. Tom stood among the bodies of El Cazador and his crew, smoke still curling from his guns, feeling the weight of what he'd just done settle into his bones. These weren't the first men he'd killed, but they were the first he'd killed for the right reasons in 20 years, and that made all the difference. Maria appeared at his side, the leather satchel clutched to her chest, tears streaming down her face, not from fear, but from something deeper and more complex. "You did it," she whispered. "You saved me." But Tom was already reloading his guns with the mechanical precision of a man who knew the fight wasn't over. Don Carlos would send more men, better men, and next time they'd come with a small army instead of just 5 killers. "We need to get these papers to someone who can use them," Tom said, his voice carrying the authority of a man who just remembered his purpose in life. "The territorial governor in Tucson, maybe the federal marshal in Phoenix. Someone with enough power to shut down Don Carlos's operation before he kills more innocent people." Maria nodded, understanding flooding her dark eyes. They weren't just running anymore. They were carrying evidence that could topple a criminal empire. But as they prepared for the journey ahead, Tom looked back at his simple cabin, the sanctuary that had sheltered him for 2 decades. He was leaving it forever, he knew that much. The hermit who'd built that life was as dead as El Cazador, replaced by something harder and more focused. For the first time in 20 years, Thomas Harrow had found a cause worth fighting for, and a woman worth dying beside. What happened next would change everything. The final confrontation came not in some dusty street at high noon, but in the marble halls of the territorial capital in Tucson, where corruption wore 3-piece suits and justice was bought and sold like cattle. Don Carlos Delgado had arrived ahead of them, his wealth and influence opening doors that should have been closed to a man with blood on his hands. But Tom and Maria carried something more powerful than money: the truth, written in the old man's own hand and sealed with the blood of innocence. Governor Samuel Harrison listened to their evidence with the careful attention of a politician who'd survived 20 years in territorial politics by knowing when the wind was changing direction. The documents Maria had risked everything to preserve painted a picture of corruption so vast it reached from the Mexican border all the way to Washington, D.C. arms deals, murdered families, bribed officials, massacred villages. It was all there in black and white, signed and witnessed by men who'd thought they were untouchable. "This is quite a story you're telling, Mr. Harrow," Governor Harrison said carefully, his eyes moving between the legendary gunfighter and the young Mexican woman who'd brought down an empire with nothing but courage and conscience. "But Don Carlos is a respected businessman, a pillar of the community south of the border. Are you prepared to stake your life on the accuracy of these accusations?" Tom looked at Maria, saw the steel in her spine, and found his voice one more time. "Governor," Tom said, his words carrying the weight of 20 years' worth of silence, "I've already staked my life on it. The question is, are you prepared to stake yours on doing what's right?" Outside the Capitol building, Don Carlos's hired guns waited in the shadows, knowing that if the governor acted on this evidence, their comfortable world of purchased violence would come crashing down. But inside those marble halls, justice was about to find its voice, and what happened next would echo through history. 3 months later, Don Carlos Delgado stood in shackles before a federal judge in Phoenix, his empire of blood and gold crumbling around him like a house built on sand. Vicente Morales had fled to South America, but not before federal marshals had frozen every bank account and seized every property connected to the conspiracy. The evidence Maria had carried out of Mexico in that leather satchel had done more than expose corruption. It had saved countless lives by shutting down a network of killers that had operated with impunity for over a decade. Tom and Maria stood together on the courthouse steps as justice was finally served, her small hand in his weathered one, both of them carrying scars that would never fully heal but had become symbols of survival rather than defeat. The territorial governor had offered Tom a badge, a return to law enforcement with full authority to clean up the remaining corruption along the border. But the legendary gunfighter had politely declined, explaining that he'd found a different kind of purpose in life. They were married by Padre Miguel in a small church outside Tucson, surrounded by friends they'd made during their fight for justice and a future that stretched out before them bright with possibility. Tom had finally learned the difference between justice and vengeance, between protecting the innocent and feeding his own pride. Maria had proven that courage wasn't the absence of fear, it was doing what's right even when you're terrified of the consequences. As they rode west toward California and a new